working at a hair story project which does the simple black feminist womanist work of telling women's stories. She was co-founder of the Women of Color Consciousness Racing Group at UCT, co-organizer of the first Africanist Womanist workshop at UCT in 1998. She has remained an activist and is currently a member of the Sarah Bartman Center for Women and Children Volunteer Program, as well as a member of their board. She is also chairperson of the Sarah Bartman Cultural Council and a founder member of the KIP Women's Center, an NGO dedicated to research against gender-based violence. Yvette.
It says, thanks be to Mother from whom all blessings flow. Let me just, thank you. Thanks to Genevieve and Heidi for inviting me here, by the way. Thank you. I wasn't going to come, and then Heidi said, well, think about it, and then she managed to change my mind, and since I came, I'm very, very happy to be here. Now, just to explain something about my religion, I recognize intellectually that the great creator is above gender, because the great creator has created the species that are one gender, and the species that are two genders, and the species that are three genders. So quite obviously you can't create something that you are not. So therefore, the great creator, to the great creator, gender is a plaything. Is that better?
Okay. You don't just hold it like that. No.
Okay. That said, my own human comprehension prefers to think of the great creator as female, and therefore I will use words like mother. I will speak of goddess, recognizing that this is my way of reaching towards the divine. I am a child who prefers to comprehend in terms that are comprehensible to me. So yeah, there's a difference between the intellectual and the emotional, I think, is what I'm trying to say. It's a bit strange to be on the panel with present matriarchal societies, because Khoikhoi matriarchies in the pure sense don't actually exist anymore. I mean, for good reason. We were colonized for 350 years, we had 250 years of slavery, we had 48 years of apartheid, and after that we had structural adjustment. So, you know, for anything in its pure form to survive those kind of conditions, it would be kind of strange. What I'm going to do, I'm first going to provide a broad African theory of African matriarchies, a feminist update of that. I'm then going to look at the pure form, meaning what people would have done, say, 25,000 years ago. Briefly review the developments of the past 2,000 years, and then with the theme, it's not what we do, but how we do it, that you can spot the remains of matriarchal culture. Try and explain a little specifically about the Khoikhoi's matriarchal today. And for those of you who don't know, the Khoikhoi are the South African indigenous peoples, and I use that term to designate all the First Nations peoples, meaning whether they hunted or gathered or were pastoralists. My own Khoikhoi ancestors were iron workers, they made pots and digging implements and things like that, but I do not identify the particular mode of production with an ethnic identity or with a specific community. So I use the term quite simply, all the Southern African First Nations peoples. So that's who we are, the Khoikhoi. My colleague Bernedette will use a slightly different term, Khoisan. She will explain that as well. They're both good. There's not a problem with either of them. African matriarchies. The late great Cheikh Anta Diop was a Senegalese historian who wrote his first PhD thesis in 1960 at the University of Paris, was, to my mind, the originator of historiographical theories of matriarchies in Africa. He lived too early to read people like Imbutas and Sande, but he did, for instance, he cites Bachhofen quite extensively, so there's a certain amount of cross-cultural fertilization. It was one of the reasons that pleased me particularly to be able to be at this conference and bring back, so to speak, the German trends and the African trends. Now, Diop's theory, and by the way, I have to mention he was my role model when I wrote my PhD, because the University of Paris failed him, and he subsequently went home to Senegal and wrote a second thesis. And I always thought, well, if they fail me, then I'll do a Diop, I'll just write another one. He proposes three main ideas about African matriarchies. The first being that it is possible to write a recorded African history of the last 2,000 years based on African written sources. Now, when he was writing in the 60s, this was an incredibly revolutionary idea. People preferred to think of Africa as a place where there was no written history, and that it was not possible to do written history about. And of course, this was one of the first reasons why University of Paris found it so incredibly controversial. I was rereading his chapter 1 in volume 2 of UNESCO's History of Africa the other night, and he devotes an entire chapter to proving that the ancient Egyptians were black, up to and including quoting European archaeologists who says, yes, they were black as to skin color, but they were actually white. So, when we consider Diop's theories, we have to think of the times and the historiographical context in which he was writing. I mean, that a man of such genius had to devote his time and effort to rebutting such utter silliness. I mean, this shows you somewhere where he came from. It's interesting reading. You should read it whenever you get a chance. His two books, the two most famous ones, of course, Civilizational Barbarism and The Cultural Unity of Black Africa. And they hold, I think, in the US an annual Diop conference. I've never been able to attend, and they don't have a website, but you people who live there should check it out. They have an email or something. The revolutionary idea about 2,000 years of African history, what Diop was trying to say was, when you date the history of Africa beginning from Northern European colonialism, you're not going to understand anything about Africa. You're not going to understand anything at all. And that if you are to begin to understand African history in terms of how Africans think about their own history, you've got to go back further. And that is, of course, being a very thorough man, he would then start his researches with the ancient Egyptians, and he would systematically chart the amount of written sources, Arabic script, Greek and Roman writing, pictographs, hieroglyphs, and so on and so forth, from which it is possible to write African history. His key dates, apart from the ancient Egyptians, who are, I don't know how many thousand years BC, is it 2,000? 3,000, somewhere around there, are the Greek and Roman colonization of Egypt a couple of centuries before the birth of Christ, the Arab colonization from the east, and of course the incredible influence of the Twin Rivers civilizations on North African matriarchies and patriarchies. And then the slave trade, being the Chinese and the Arab slave trade to the east, starting from about the 10th century, and the Portuguese and Spanish slave trade, and later on, of course, British slave trade to the west, starting from about the 15th century. So what Diop says is you have to look at all these events. You cannot begin to start the history of Africa in the 1880s when most of the place was colonized, because then nothing is going to make any sense to you at all. And again, in the 60s, this was an incredible, revolutionary idea. Diop's main thesis then, and why we still love and revere him, of course, he put gender at the heart of African history. Briefly, what he said was, and you can see from his theories that he read people like Bachhofen very closely, that all African societies were originally matriarchal, and that patriarchy was something that came from outside. And that is why he charts these various colonizations and the internal African diaspora that was set off by the slave trade, because what he's doing is charting the conversion from matriarchy to patriarchy. And of course it's very interesting because it fits into the broader debate about the origins of patriarchy. But Diop is perfectly straightforward. He says, as far as Africa is concerned, there is no indigenous origin. The origin is exogenous, and it can be clearly traced through written sources. hold my mic close, sorry. Okay. So that is what he says. Now, of course, for those of us who are African historians and women, this is a very beautiful theory. It enables us to do a gendered history from beginning to end, and moreover to do 2,000 years worth of gendered history. I'm going to leave Diop there and go over to Yvette Muthien feminist update, because Diop, part of being such a great genius, you stand at the mountaintop. He was right in all the big things. He was wrong about a lot of the details, sometimes very confused or very far gone children, but Yvette Muthien then does a feminist update in the 90s. I can't remember the title of the book, but I have it in my hotel room, so if anybody wants to come ask me tomorrow, I will bring it. Says, well, firstly, you've got to distinguish between matriarchy and matrilineal. Because in effect what Diop was talking about and the multitude of examples that he was using from his own people, the Wolof, was not a pure matriarchy but a matrilineal system, meaning matrilocality, you live with the mother, matrilineal, you trace your descent through the mother, but amongst the contemporary Wolof in the 1960s, most of the authority being placed in the mother's brother or your maternal uncle. Inheritance systems going through the maternal uncle. And Muthien then making the point, this is very common. It's very common as a transition stage from the pure matriarchy, as so excellently outlined by Dr. Abendroth yesterday, to a more patriarchal stage. And of course, if we understand the Wolof, that makes perfect sense. Right, in the 1960s, they had these various colonizations and slave trades going on. So it would be odd if there was a pure matriarchy existing. Diop's evidence, by the way, is excellent. Apart from archaeology, there's a lot of linguistic analyses. And through this, you can trace that the Wolof historically would have been more matriarchal than they were at the time that he was writing. So, Muthien prefers generally to use the term matrilineal, because she argues that present matriarchies in Africa are more often matrilineal than purely matriarchal. Muthien other important update then saying that Diop needs to look more at the issue of indigenous people. And what she does, she uses Diop's theories to look at, briefly, I don't see the 10-minute sign, but very briefly, 2,000 years of African history. The Greek and Roman colonization of North Africa pushed a lot of people south. Not so much, and you can think to yourself that if you are being colonized if you are a peaceful matriarchal society and you are being colonized by a warlike power, you have one of two. Oh, you want to put this? I'm still disturbing? Slight technical glitch. You have one of two choices. The one is to develop a patriarchy, in other words, to meet violence with violence. And you can see a number of reasons why a warlike society would have to be patriarchal. It would have to be patriarchal because you would have to train people in the consciousness that killing is okay. Now, in a matriarchal society, that value doesn't exist. You first have to develop it. And once you begin to develop it, you will introduce certain taboos. One of them being people who reproduce should not kill. You follow. So you begin to develop, there are people who reproduce, they give life, therefore they should not take life. There are other people who do not reproduce, it's okay for them to go out and take life in order to safeguard the child. Now, of course, you try to persuade a young man to devote his life to killing or being killed. You have to provide him with food, you have to train him for a number of years, and suddenly men begin to become more powerful in society. Quite obviously, you're putting a weapon in somebody's hand, you're teaching him that violence is okay. Sooner or later, he's going to look at you, even though you may be his mother, his sister, or his daughter, and say, well, then it's okay with you too. Sure, 2,000 years. So what Muthien says is, sorry, back to you. What Diop says is, the Greek and Roman colonization set in motion people either running away from the violence or becoming patriarchal, staying in the same place and becoming patriarchal in response to the violence. What Muthien says is no, there was a third option. There were a bunch of people who preserved various forms of matriarchy or matrilineal, who simply stayed in the same place and let waves of patriarchs wash over them. And if you lived in the wrong place, say Mali, somewhere in West Africa, you'd have the northern people moving south over you, possibly moving way back south. You'd have the Arabs coming this way, the Portuguese coming that way, you know, after them, the Dutch, after them, the British. I mean, there'd be a number of waves of colonization. So to choose to remain matriarchal and to preserve matriarchal values in a situation like this is very, very difficult. But it's also a very conscious choice. It is not an accident. So Amadou divides in African peoples into two types of peoples. Indigenous people, meaning people who stayed in the same place, where they are rooted with the ancestral spirits of the land, and people who moved back and forward. Now I think it's important to mention this because when we talk about African diaspora, we tend to talk about the people who left the continent. But we forget about the incredible internal diaspora. And yet I don't think you understand the history of any African country today if you don't understand this internal diaspora. And the fact that South Africa is a typical example, Namibia just to the north and another, where by and large, there are exceptions like the Bengal people, but by and large the people who came in were patriarchal and warlike, and the people who stayed in the same place were various forms of matriarchy and rather peaceful people. So, between Diop and Amadou, we have a gendered theory of African history that makes sense of all these things. And it does, for the first time I think in African historiography, speak about indigenous peoples. So you can see why I was very happy with Amadou, because it was hard to find a theoretical way to introduce my reality and the reality of my people. Thanks to Amadou, it makes perfect sense. And in fact, if I look in terms of my ancestry, then all these things start to make sense. I have a great-grandmother, she is Herero. Her people walked down from Eastern Africa away from the troubles. It took them about 600 years. Now, they were matriarchal when they started walking. And somewhere between Kenya and Tanzania, they lived, somewhere Great Lakes region. And they stayed matriarchal because they simply kept on walking until they came to Namibia, found colonialism coming from the other side, the Dutch and the British and the German colonialism from the southwest coast. And thanks to the missionaries in the 1840s actually began practicing patrilineal. So still today amongst the Hebrew, you have a matrilineal inheritance system and you have a newer patrilineal one overlaid. And you can imagine how people argue when somebody does. Should you inherit from your mother's brother or should you inherit from your father? You know, it can go on for 4 years. So that's my one great-grandmother's son, my other great-grandmother, my great-grandmother, originally lived in southern Angola, but moved south to Namibia away from the slave trade, the Portuguese slave trade in the west, and of course all the other people who were seeking peace in Angola. And that is why the Dama is koi for black. They're normally called the black koi. You get the black koi, the red koi, and the yellow koi. And it obviously has to do with your distance from the equator. It's a simple physiological fact. But now you find very, very black koi living in what is today Namibia. The genotypically should not be living there. They should be living much further north. But because of the disruptions. Okay, so, and a lot of people in Southern Africa, you look into their ancestry, you'll see this huge history playing out in very personal histories. Now, back to, and I want to set up the pure Khoi matriarchal culture as a standard of reference, as something that was not an imaginary but a recorded history. Recorded, if you think of rock art as a form of recording history, recorded for the past 25,000 years. And it's pretty much everything that Dr. Adenov said yesterday. The only hierarchy being an age hierarchy, something which obviously empowered women because women just simply tend to live longer than men. So the old mother of the clan being the most powerful person. That said, very difficult to build up any form of power in a society that is not class, not race, and gendered in the, this is going to sound strange to African Americans, complementary but equal sense. Now, in a society that's not a class society and not a racist society, you can deliver that. You can deliver women gather, men hunt, but we are equal, except that what elder says go, and of course the eldest being the mother, what she says goes for everybody. Not having private property in land, the Khoikhoi could not develop classes. And class society had only begun. You can actually see the Oedipus theory play itself out in the past 200 years or so, beginning to develop a class society in the 19th century as they make the some of Khoikhoi societies, the Rama, the Griqua, foremost amongst them, developing towards a more warlike society. From a pure matriarchal clan system, where there are no chiefs, there are no royalties, there are no commoners, suddenly we begin to develop the distributive chieftainship. You know the distributive chieftain, where suddenly there's a situation of scarcity because we're experiencing enormous population pressure from the north and colonialism from the south and slavery on the west coast. Beginning to develop redistributive chieftainships. Also at that point beginning to develop ritualized systems of gift giving. Now what I'm trying to say is in a classless society there's no prestige attached to gifting. You give because you are human. But as you begin to move towards a more classed, raced and gendered society, one of the developments you see along with the redistributive chieftainship is the prestige rituals. The more you give, the more honor you receive kind of idea. It is an intermediate stage. It is part of a development towards the patriarchy. And the society institutes it to undercut the class system. What I'm trying to say, the very fact that you have to try and undercut a class system means a class system is beginning to develop. Therefore, it's not a pure matriarchy anymore. It all makes sense, right? 2,000 years ago, okay. Fortunately for the Khoikhoi, it's only the past 200 years that these things start to happen, so we're able to track them. From the redistributive chieftainships of the late 18th, early 19th century to development of the war chiefs from about 1795 onwards, our great resistance heroes, the Yvette boys, the Cooks, the Abramses, and so on and so forth. But still up until the 1890s, very strong rights for women, rights in terms of ownership of cattle, ownership of household implements. We still didn't own much land, but that was no longer because of religious problems, that was because the white people had taken pretty much all of it. By 1909, we were almost completely dispossessed except for mission stations. So, the development of war chiefs, and with that a gradual move towards further and further patriarchy, the locking us in as either an urbanized landless class or a rural landless farm workers, or mission stations being our only options, the development of Christianity. And with Christianity, the completion of patriarchy. Right. Now, the good news being, all of this happens after 1909. It's in very recent, it's within historical memory, so that somebody like me who wants to reach back to my great-grandmother's tradition of matrilineal is not a problem. It's only 3 generations back. It's harder for people from further south, like Cape Town, where there's 250 years of slavery. I mean, they practice matrilineal for very different and much more horrible reasons, of course. But yeah, so there are a number of matriarchal or matrilineal customs remaining. I think the greatest one being, people move into the middle class, but they also tend to despise it. There's a very conflicted relationship towards material goods. There's also very strange gender roles, and again I'll use my example. I have 2 brothers. No sisters except sister cousins. My brothers are the one who have the kids. I'm the one who's most educated and, in a professional sense, best qualified. So, in my family, this is not an odd thing. So, how we do things, how we think about things, how we may live an outwardly patriarchal life. I mean, Abrams is my father's name, it's his slave name, it's from Cape Town. But we do acknowledge my lineage towards my mother's mother. And this is not considered a strange thing. One last example I want to... I've still got time, okay. One last example that I want to give before I move on to the whole issue of indigenous plants. When you do not have gender oppression, you also do not have control of women's sexuality. And this is evident in the historical Khoi in a number of ways. Khoi women tended not to have more than 1 or 2 children, maybe 3. They also were not agriculturalists. I don't know what that does to all the European theories of matriarchy as a specifically agricultural phenomenon. This is certainly not true for the Khoi, it might be true for other parts of Africa. We only really start to develop practicing agriculture in the late 1800s. As we begin to need to use land more intensively. There are 2 great moves towards more productive technology. The one being about 2,000 years ago when we adjusted the diaspora by becoming pastoralists. So we moved from pure hunter-gathering to pastoralism. Some of us, others just continued hunting and gathering and herding the eland, which was a wild buffalo. And the second one then being, this dated from the late 1600s, a move towards agriculture. Both are obviously moves to accommodating more population on a limited amount of ground. But the higher population is not coming from Khoi women having more children, it's coming from people fleeing from the north and the extreme violence that this is happening in the north because of the slave trade. Even after Khoi women were settled, they in fact really didn't have many more children. And this had to do partly with their knowledge of rhythm systems. Our religion is a moon religion, partly with the knowledge of indigenous herbs, herbal contraceptives, reproductive technologies, and of course herbal abortifacients, which would be a last resort. And for instance, people who've done the demography of slaves in the Western Cape notice a strange thing, which is slave women in the Cape never reproduced the slave population. Under slavery, 2.5 centuries, the increase in slave population came from bringing people from outside. It never came from the local slave population, women increasing. Now, this is a very strange thing until we remember that the slaves that came from Mozambique, Angola, and the East, I have one great-grandmother from the East as well, the Javanese Islands, and Ceylon, intermarried and lived with the Khoi, the people. So they passed their knowledge of herbs onto the slaves that came from elsewhere and developed a very mutual kind of culture. We see this, and the slaves that came from the East were mostly Islamicized. But we see this in that the first Afrikaans is the trio, the slave language that they developed in order to talk to each other. The first piece of written Afrikaans was written in the 1890s. It's written in Arabic script. The language is a slave Creole, and it talks about indigenous plants. Now, where does that come from? It comes from the indigenous people, because people don't rock up from elsewhere and say, oh, this plant looks good for this, you know. So in my mind, that is the secret why the slave women's population. The slave women could not reproduce the population. They typically would have no more than 3 children. I think that's rather unique about slavery in the Cape. I don't know. I don't know enough about slavery elsewhere to be able to say. Yes, sorry. Well, what I find interesting about these reproductive technologies, now, you know, other people like Engels who propose matriarchal theories have also proposed it together with a rather racist theory of development. You know, first you're these primitive hordes, and then you invent something and you move on to agriculture, and you invent something, you move on to feudalism, and then capitalism, and, you know, so black people who really got even as far as hunter-gatherers like us, stay somewhere amongst those barbarous hordes. Now, with the Khoi, not so. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that they knew of these technologies. Like I say, 2,000 years ago, we were hunter-gatherers. We milked the eland, the wild buffalo, but we never domesticated it. So it's not we did not have knowledge of how to do it, it's we never had to do it because there weren't enough of us to have to bother. Hunter-gathering is classically, it's a less labor-intensive lifestyle. It's land-extensive, but it doesn't require a lot of labor. You move from hunter-gathering to pastoralism, you can feed more people of less land, but you have to work harder. So, and likewise, again, with agriculture. You can feed more people on less land as compared to pastoralism, but it takes agriculturalists tend to work very much harder as compared to hunter-gatherers. So it's not that we didn't know how to do things like plant a seed and watch it grow, you know. And there's quite some evidence, for instance, of selection of certain strains, or you know, there was a goodish deal of seed improvement, but there wasn't really agriculture because we didn't need it. We rather controlled our population. And because yes, and how are we able to do that? By allowing women freedom of sexuality. This is one of the nice things. This is one of the nice things about matriarchy. A woman's sexuality does not have to be controlled. And once you don't have to control what she does with her body, you don't have to control her. Right? About this thing being the Khoikhoi being classless, not racist, and not sexist, didn't have to control whether you were homo or heterosexual. And I'm going to end on that note, I think, because, you know, I'm not one of these people that go, oh, is homosexuality an African? You know, I don't find it interesting except for the specter of a number of non-African researchers going into African communities where there's two little old ladies who've been living together, been living for 20 years, and they go, so do you do it? I'm getting slapped. You know, I don't address any of that stuff. I've never had the guts to ask anybody who's older than me what they actually do. One of the ways you can see our matriarchal antecedents is most of us possess an aunt or an uncle who, I was laughing yesterday when somebody said, so I went to the homosexual, I took my dress fabrics, now I went, oh, it sounds so like home, you know, except we're even worse, you know, we say, oh, we went to the homosexual and did our hair. I mean, it's not right, you know. But particularly in the Southwestern Cape, and following the coast up northwards towards Namibia, this is a very strong tradition. You will have, and it's tied somehow to economic independence, so typically school teachers, nurses, places with a large concentration of women like gardens or textile factories. You know, you have two ladies living together, and in the parlance of the times, never got married. Or my favorite, died a virgin. Many of us possessing an aunt or uncle who never got married, but who pose enormously beautiful role models in terms of non-compulsory heterosexuality, female independence, not needing the patriarchy, which not one is a different thing from not needing men. I mean, men are your sons, they're your brothers, they're your nephews, whatever, but not needing patriarchal oppression in order to get by. And it's a very, very common experience. I only just started researching it, but to me ties into general First Nations culture. What we have, therefore, now in South Africa today is largely patriarchal culture. I say largely because many of them, like the Xhosa, are intermarried with us and retain strong matrilineal elements, but largely patriarchal cultures who have been Christianized, and in the name then of Christianity, discriminate against alternative forms of sexualities. So you have a foreign religion coming up against an African kind of religion which fundamentally nobody really cares. Like I say, what people care about is intrusion of privacy, not so much what you do once you're there. Fundamentally, the one discriminating against the other. Now, in my head, that's not particularly African. And yeah, I hope this short historical oversight has shown you why I think so. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, not to intrude on question time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yvette. Oh, it was wonderful. Now I would like to introduce to you Bernedette Muthien. Is it pronounced correctly? Muthien. Bernedette Muthien. Bernedette is based in Cape Town, South Africa, and is a member of the Pan-African Gender Network, Matriarchal, and serves on the Executive Council of the International Peace Research Association, for which she is editor of publications and co-convener of the Global Political Economy Commission, as well as active member of the Conflict Resolution and Peace-Building Commission. She also serves on a number of international advisory boards, including for 2 international journals, Human Security Studies and Queries, Africa editor. A former anti-apartheid activist who spent time in prisons during adolescence due to her youth and student leadership, Bernadette's life work is centered on concrete consciousness transformation in the intersecting areas of genders and sexualities, justice and peace. She believes in accessible research and writing, and has published both academic and creative writing, especially poetry, locally and abroad. She is founding director of a registered NGO called In Gender. Please, Bernadette, help me welcome Bernadette.
To pay tribute to this meeting in particular, which is extraordinarily exciting to me to be here, I thought that I would look at my origins in a different way to the traditional ways that we look at patriarchy. And look at our origins in terms of the surnames we have, like mine is Muthien, which comes from my father, who comes from India, and to also look at the ways in which we construct things alternative to the ways we've been taught with European systems of education. So I really like this quote from Alice Walker's anthology called Once, which reads itself: to build a hut, one needs mud, sisal, and friendly neighbors. This was my beautiful mother, descendant of the Khoi, and I needed to clarify, I believe, that why I use the term Khoi-san rather than Khoi-Khoi, because of the split, the cleavages in the colonial understanding of the Khoi and the San as 2 separate groups of people, and so not to exclude those who consider themselves San, but to again embrace everything in terms of completeness, wholeness, interconnectedness, and interdependence. Now, my mother obviously came from somewhere. She was not immaculately conceived, though I have had a kind of immaculate conception vision, which inspired a poem, which we can talk about another time. So I do believe it's possible. If you believe anything is possible. And this was my mother's parents, my father and mother, and 2 eldest brothers. So that is my beautiful mother who passed away. And my father is in the middle, in the front in the red shirt. I don't really remember the events around the picture taking. I realized as I was pasting photographs, scanning and pasting photographs into PowerPoint to contextualize who I am beyond the kind of linear ways we usually do. I'm an anti-apartheid activist and, a good Marxist until this and that time. And then, I had a vision and came to that's enough. So I realized that the picture is like arranged, This was, I think it was the day my mother died, or the day after or something, and knowing linear at the time. And so these are my siblings, except for my youngest one, and my father is from India in the front. So now that we've contextualized where I come from in relation to my late mother, my father's also there. This is Table Mountain, which is the very ancient, hundreds of thousands of years old, very sacred mountain range, also extraordinarily touristic. But beyond that, it's a very, very powerful space. And around this mountain, a range of mountains, the city of Cape Town is located. Cape Town is a peninsula, so it has the two oceans, the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, on either side of it, with this awesome, sacred, powerful mountain. This is one of the ancient sites that the ancient indigenous people, the Khoi, the Khoisan, the Khoi Kuku, however you want to name them, I should call them the ancient people, First Nations people, that they used for astronomical purposes, tracking time, tracking constellations, etc. An incredibly powerful site where even if you use those sticks called dust sticks, they go zing zing like back and forth. It's kind of cool, but you don't really need that. You just need hands to test it. And this is a friend of mine took this photograph during solstice. These sites were obviously used for ceremonial purposes and all kinds of other purposes. This is during a solstice. The sun hits, strikes the rock in a particular way, which determines all kinds of cool things. I studied science first before I came to social science, and now I've come to sense, hopefully. This is that's can you see what it is? Can you see now? Can you see better now? Yeah, it's like one of those ancient snapshots. And that too is used for astronomical and other such like purposes, because during particular times of the year, like a solstice or such like, the sun strikes this spot thing just like that in the center. It's quite awesome, but for a split second only, and it goes away. And it's the same as many other sites like Machu Picchu in Peru, many other places all over the world. We won't go into sacred geometry much, but I just wanted to show you where I come from and how privileged I am to be in this space. Oh, that's a So I came to matriarchal studies in a quite non-linear way, as you might determine, those of you who've had the pleasure of chatting with me, especially over smoke. That I'm kind of non-linear. There's nothing about linearity that grabs me, it just doesn't work. So I came to it in a very non-linear way. It began with my accidental, everything I consider it accidental or whatever, predetermined destiny, whatever, how I came back from having come to this country to study immediately after our first elections in '94, to then being immersed in peace studies, as in conflict resolution, nation building, all that stuff. Immediately after apartheid. And then later still, I found myself running a program, and Yvette and I worked at the same place at the University of Cape Town, and trying to understand gender-based violence, why it happens, how it happens, and how, more significant for me, how we could transcend that. And on the third level, how I came to matriarchal studies, apart from hearing about Heide's work from both Yvette and others in Europe, was trying to make sense of the intuitions that I was increasingly getting, intuitions, senses of affirmation around what I call fluidities or in-betweenities, things that transcend the binaries or polar opposites, which serves patriarchy so well, and which, indeed, I would argue, on which patriarchy is premised, the idea of othering and all that. So all this makes this the kind of discoveries in quantum physics for me quite interesting. As science increasingly nowadays, for the last while, has been, its purpose, I think, has been to affirm what the ancient people have always known. That is from the Khoi to the Zapotec to the Khasi to all the ancient people of the world over on each continent. The profoundly simple interconnectedness and interdependence of all things. And I would like to share just some of this science with you, just very, very briefly, to make the point that I have. I find people, different people, not necessarily this group of wonderful people, like the kind of rootedness of European science, despite its interesting origins. So around the issue of the notion of wholeness and similarity, as posited in the field of modern quantum physics, by the likes of, for example, David Bohm, who lived from 1917 to 1992. In his work, ancient knowledge became scientific truth, as truth, provable, demonstrable, tangible. For example, the saying that pre-exists in ancient indigenous spirituality, of course, as above, so below, as below, so above. And Einstein's popular equation, E equals mc squared, not only states that energy can't be created or destroyed, but also affirms stuff that we've always known throughout time, but this just, affirms it for us in their patriarchal language. Energy and matter are different forms of the same whole. And so Bohm suggested that energy and matter are inextricably tied to the third element, which he called meaning or consciousness, to which I can only reply, duh. Tropical linear kind of conferences that we have to go to, they like this stuff for me to show them where this stuff comes from. So it's been kind of paradigm shift for me to not dull or bore you with like showing like, this is what a patriarchy looks like, this is what a matriarchy looks like. So I'm just trying to straddle the line and be fluid and in between the traditional patriarchal conferences I'm so used to and this awesome space. So Bohm worked with a modern phenomenon of fractal geometry, I'm sure many of you know about it, with the so-called Mandelbrot set, which remarkably illustrates that each object has within itself embedded precise replicas of itself. Like, so, if you think of successive Russian or Latrushka dolls, where no two dolls are precisely alike, but very similar in structure. So the part contains the whole as the whole contains the part. And in this way, in modern science, quantum physics, is echoed the ancient knowledge of, for example, the notion of Ubuntu, and other Asian cultures throughout the world, including modern Christian beliefs about, we are reflections of God, scientifically verified. I find quantum physics exciting. I'm sorry if nobody else is as excited as I am. It's the revisionism, there's such exciting stuff. Like matriarchal studies, look at this meeting, it's truly awesome. It's people, good people coming out and revising the origins of things. Like there's this 10th century Arab scholar Al-Hazmi. I mean, they stole, the Pythagoras stole off, because of particular gaps in his theorem, that stole that, and it showed that the Arabic scholar was working on mathematics at the same time, and didn't complete those two gaps. The Pythagoras just literally translated from Arabic and didn't, that's plagiarism. So this 10th century Arab scholar, whom nobody's ever heard of, Al-Hazmi, and he informed Descartes' thinking as well as Isaac Newton's. So he formulated his theories of vision and light, which debunked the somewhat arrogant and superstitious so-called ray theory of the Greek scientist Euclid, by proving that light enters our eyes in straight lines from everywhere in our environment, instead of it goes from the eyes out. But so he showed this like hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and he showed and he documented so in this way that reflection and refraction both create rainbows. So it's not this or that, is everything together. So Descartes went about and he said that white light, in studying light and optics, white light comes from color. From sameness comes difference and separation. So you do all the same, and then comes the split and cleavage. But Newton showed, on the other hand, that difference in colors generates white or colorlessness and sameness. So the rainbow constitutes white light. In other words, the spectrum creates oneness and unity. So in terms of light, oneness does not encompass diversity. We all one but different. But diversity encompasses oneness. We're all diverse and one. So, and it's echoed in all the ancient indigenous knowledges anyway. So if our foundation is diversity, a fluid spectrum of merged and primary colors, our natural inclination is to become united, seen as white colorless light, We're both intrinsically parts of spectra, observably different and simultaneously becoming colorless. Diversity, in my understanding of this, creates oneness. So in this observable sense, so beautifully quantified and stolen curry, I am because I belong in the African Ubuntu sense that Thabo Mbeki, our president, is working with in very interesting ways at the moment. I am because I belong in fluid and multiple ways to both parts of the spectrum as well as the colorless collective. So Ubuntu speaks of the very essence of being human. You are generous, you're hospitable, you're friendly, caring and compassionate. You share what you have. It's to say, my humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in yours. We belong in a bundle of life. A person is a person through other persons. So it's very different to Descartes' idea, I think, therefore I am. But more, I am human because I belong, I participate, I share. And it's this acknowledgement of diversities and simultaneous acknowledgement of all being alike part of the greater whole, each reflection of everything else, this provides the essential foundations of my understanding of my people's spirituality. And I think it's becoming so mainstream nowadays. The idea of matriarchs, it's only in Europe, and I don't know so much about North America anymore. I don't come in so frequently, but in Europe especially Deutschland, it's the most extraordinary thing, you know, when I speak, because if it's like conflict or security or stuff like that, or gender violence or something, invariably I will use the matriarchal models, which I initially derived from the Buddhas, but more lately, so grateful to Mahayana. They like freak out. It's like, it's hectic for them. And, I come from Kapstadt, Cape Town. Where's the pretty place? I come from ancestors. That's where I come from, and it's so beautiful. And in this outpost, very, very far south, very beautiful place, this is in our weekly newspaper, which to be a lefty one, an article on goddesses, That's how mainstream it is where I come from. And it doesn't freak us out so much. And I think part of that is how embedded various cultures, various societies, various continents are in terms of their thinking and their stealing, and in terms of how they benefit and buy into the system. Now, I have two poems here which I will leave with you, and I can't decide which one to leave in. Sacred. Okay, sacred it is. I'll leave you with one poem, and you're welcome to ask us questions, I suppose. Is that all right? I didn't like it as a matter.
Mike to put your questions. I think it's best.
Hi. I just want to thank you all and ask what's for me a difficult question. And it's in terms of working in North America, which has been so poisoned by slavery and white supremacy. And I realize it's a different context, but in my work, I have found there's always a tension and a struggle between talking about patriarchy and matriarchy as the root of the problems we face, as opposed to many African American people who will feel that the root of the problem is racism and white supremacy. So I'm asking for your insight and your direction, how to proceed in the kind of world that we have here in North America, which there's so much conflict, in terms of building solidarity to analyze and dismantle patriarchy when the legacy of white supremacy and racism and slavery is so incredibly strong that it's very difficult to see them perhaps in a historical way. So for example, people may well see that racism there's a primacy of the racist struggle over the struggle to dismantle patriarchy. So I hope I'm making myself clear, and I just wanted for your input, your insight, your direction. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to be very responsible, so I'm not going to mention the one word reparations, okay? And especially not in the company of people like Genevieve who never talk the talk but who actually walk the walk. I mean, I don't think you have to go very far. Look, what Diop does is he says, patriarchy came to Africa because of colonialism and slavery. And the minute that he does that, what he's saying is you cannot separate white supremacy from class hierarchies, from gender hierarchies. So since 40 years there's been a theory that says you've got to look at all of this, and you've got to look at it in the historical context, written by black people, based on written sources done by black people. So you know, when you begin to approach stuff like that, it's really not the problem. I think the problem is, and this is classic, I mean, many diaspora feminists have said it, I think possibly when you are white and middle class, it's easy to exaggerate the importance of the one oppression that you do suffer, namely gender oppression, but that any effective strategy has got to look at all of it. And I mean, Audre Lorde didn't write much history, but she said it very simply when she said, well, how can you be a feminist if you don't do anti-racist work? How can you be a feminist if you're not doing something about patriarchy? So yeah, I hope that helps.
Ridiculous.
I'll go to the limp mic. Thank you. This has been extraordinary. So much information, I didn't think I could absorb it or be with it. And I have extra strength because it's so fascinating. I have a huge question regarding balance. And God mentioned it specifically in his talking with us. And I think that balance is something that we women understand deep in our souls. And that it is our responsibility to bring balance to the world because we have that visceral understanding. And my question has to do with medicine and healing, and whether anyone on the dais now would like to give their reactions to the possibility that we find balance between the great deep knowledge of tradition, Aboriginal traditions, ancient traditions, with the more Western and now demonized, often ways of fabricating enough medicine for pandemics, whether we can find balance between those two worlds, because I believe we must, and I hope that somebody here might speak to that. Thank you.
Well, I think when we speak about traditional medicine, every people, every nation has had traditional medicine. Orthodox medicine has developed from traditional medicine, and we still have packets of traditional medicine even today here in highly developed America. I think the awareness to know what traditional medicine can do is the most important thing, and not just saying, yeah, the Western medicine or Orthodox medicine is doing this and that and that. I think in Germany, for instance, we make the experience that more and more people are going to the healing practitioners like me. And because of that, even last week when I was coming, I read an article from the chairman of the German Association of Doctors saying that they should now start thinking in another direction and don't see medicine as purely science, because there are many things which science cannot explain. I think this is a plan to take that area from us. And yeah, so I think what is the most important thing is the awareness, the individual awareness. I'm prepared to forfeit probably driving a big car to go to somebody who is doing traditional medicine who charges, and I have to pay myself. This is individual. Thank you.